Welcome to SESYNC's seminar series. We're really pleased to have you. It's a pleasure to introduce Merle. Merle is an environmental historian. He's done some pretty amazing work on pandemic plagues, mostly in antiquity, but you can imagine he's been called on pretty heavily given the current situation in the world. So he's had a really interesting and dynamic blog and been invited to speak on many of the issues that are relevant today. Merle got his master's and PhD from Princeton University in history, and actually before that, he got a master's in medieval history at King's College in London. He did his undergraduate work at Colby College, and he arrived at SESYNC in 2019. So with that, Merle, I'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for the kind introduction. So my talk today is based on some of my thinking over the last year, some of the research and writing I've done. As Margaret noted, I'm a medieval and ancient historian and environmental historian, but I've gotten more and more interested in questions of the environment and pandemics, obviously. I first started working on this in the spring of 2018, and my first article came out late summer 2019. And I remember well, actually, the moment when my interests in disease and pandemics, I thought would become more central. And as you can see by the title, this was about actually almost literally a year ago today. I was debating whether or not to write something more publicly, and I was walking through the now probably empty hallways of SESYNC, and I ran into Carrie Hertz, the former associate director of SESYNC, and asked whether or not I should write something. And to Carrie's credit, she said, obviously, I think you should, without hesitation. And the result was my first foray into this, which you can see here up on the screen on the Washington Post. And I also remember this article very well because it was literally, we were writing this a year ago to this day, and I was actually writing it in the driveway of my house in my car because, as maybe some of the SESYNC people remember, the internet had actually gone out at SESYNC and there were cleaners in my house at the time, so I couldn't go in. So I actually wrote the final version, I remember, from my car. But in any case, the point here, as you can see from the title, is that at the time, and I'll talk about today in more detail, people were comparing COVID to the 14th century medieval Black Death. And this was pretty constant in January and February. So my article here was simply saying that no, COVID is not like the Black Death for many reasons, and that making this comparison was and still is deeply problematic. In any case, this started my thinking about COVID more broadly, with really, I guess, kind of these two questions that have been perhaps at the fore. So as you can see here, how is history being used to shape and guide actions during COVID, if at all? And second, how should we use historical ideas to shape policy actions moving forward? And this is something I've spent more time on recently. And to give away the answers very quickly, but I'll go into them in more detail. Clearly, history has been used, and I'm going to look at a few examples of this and a few problems, and then look at some of these ideas moving forward. Now, many of these ideas, as I've listed on screen, you could do for various pandemics, as I showed on the opening slide, but I'm going to use two today in particular that have shown up more frequently over the last year, as I say. The first is the 1918 influenza pandemic, and broadly those 2 years, although it extends a little later. And the second is the Black Death of the mid-14th century, again, with the broad years on the screen. And many of these ideas have come from talking to other really good, smart people on a podcast I set up with another former postdoc, Lee Mordecai, who's at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It's a weekly podcast. You can see here on the screen, so you can listen to that however you listen to podcasts. So after going through kind of lessons, we might say, I'm going to point at the other thing that have been used often, which is hope, and this phrase silver linings, and then look at some new ideas and ways in which I'm thinking, which has to do with scales of experience. So one is resilience and state level and economics, another is individual experience, and the third is centering communal needs. So this, as you'll see, will follow us along as we go. I'll highlight in red where we are on the talk as we move forward. So first, I'll point out how lessons have been applied. And some of this, you probably have to dig deep into your memory of the last year, but I'm going to walk us through how this has worked. So There are many examples of past lessons, and we'll see a few more a little later on, but I want to highlight a key one that was from the spring of 2020, or as I like to call it, the long march of 2020, which was this idea that we saw trending in various ways, usually as a hashtag, very often, flatten the curve, that you probably all remember. And here's just one example of an article that appeared in National Geographic that was synthesizing this information. Now, this idea is based on a famous article from Howard Merle et al. From 2007, talking about what they called non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs. And this is based on the 1918 influenza pandemic, where they mapped out the impact of influenza in 40 plus cities in the United States. It's called non-pharmaceutical interventions because at the time, there were no real medical ways of stopping the influenza, right? They didn't know it was actually a virus killing people. They thought it was a bacteria, and a whole bunch of other things. And they came up with these curves as a way to reduce people dying all at once, right? And so you've probably seen these comparisons from various cities at the time. The most famous perhaps is Philadelphia and San Francisco, because they're so different from each other. And the idea was, if we can reduce the number of deaths during COVID, if everyone doesn't get sick all at once, all right? So Philadelphia, more people got sick famously all at one time. So here's how it showed up in popular media. And then it's based on, as I said, their article, which actually has a really nice supplementary information. You can download all of these curves as they are from a series of PowerPoints, which is where I've taken the one from Minneapolis. And this is what it looks like. The green line is the excess death rates. And at the bottom on the bars, as you can see there, are the NPIs, right, as they call them, which they group into three broad forms: public gathering bans, school closures, and other things. The important thing to keep track of here is, as the NPIs were put in place, you can basically see a rise and then a slow drop in the number of excess deaths, right? And so basically, if you go through all these slides, for the most part, all the interventions as they were put in place reduce the number of deaths. And then as they're lifted, you can see they go back up, right? Not as significantly in this case, but it's quite clear that there's a direct correlation and causation here in terms of what's put in place, right? These are many things probably many of us are now quite familiar with. So this was suggested at the beginning that if we flatten the curve, things will get better. But in reality, if you want to use Minneapolis, and I like Minneapolis for various reasons, but you can compare here Minneapolis in 1918, and then on the right, this is taken from the New York Times, from their website and tracking data about COVID, and you get a pretty actually clear picture, right? That is, what we know was happening on the left, what we talked about in March, was partially done, and then exactly at the same moment, if you track the NPIs, as they were lifted, people started dying again. Right, so that in fact, political will here is key, that we had the policy information, we had the data, but nothing was actually necessarily done in many of these cities. And I'm sure someone moving forward will do all of these cities again, and you'll rely on a lot of depressing data long term. Now, why is this the case, right? Some of you may be asking. And here again, the 1918 influenza pandemic has often been said, and it's largely the case, we can have discussions about this, but that it had left little lasting impact on politics, economics, and to some extent culture as well, right? It's been called the forgotten pandemic, as the now standard work by Alfred Crosby, who worked on it in the field. There's a little work that was done aside from his book until the early 1990s. And there's various regions for this, but that's the case. If you want to know more, I can talk about that in the Q&A. But it largely has to do with what we remember and what looms large in our imagination to an extent, right? What we think about. And so I give you as just one example here. Here's data again from number of daily deaths, which is an absolutely depressing number, from the COVID tracking project from the Atlantic here. And what I've circled on the screen and what I noticed right away is that until that point, the 2 days with the highest death total, you can see here circled in the black, it's now no longer the case, which is more depressing and sad. But the two highest days for a long time, or not for that long actually, were January 6th and 7th, right? Now, probably as all of you remember, was anyone talking about COVID and the number of deaths on January 6th and 7th? The answer there is clearly no, right? I mean, if I went to a New York Times or any other paper, it's probably not above the fold. It's probably not even below the fold, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about the coup insurrection at the Capitol on those 2 days, right? So that we already forget this and it gets pushed to the back of our mind. So that's in some ways the answer to why. Now, the second use of history that has been prolific throughout this is this idea of hope and this idea of silver linings, right? We've probably seen that phrase now, or at least I have more times than I can count. You know, it shows up as when things get back to normal, when things get better, when the world changes. And the problem here is that we often use history to comfort us in ways that are very problematic, they're very lazy, and they're very often wrong. And here I want to use the Black Death from the 14th century to give you a few examples of how this has been done. And here I'll use economics, right? Again, the Black Death shows up here, right? So the first thing I want to point out is inequality. So if you look at these series of charts from Guido Alfani, who's an economic historian, what he's done is he's looked at the percentage of wealth the top richest 10% of people owned, right? And what you can see here very clearly, I've circled, is during the Black Death, which breaks out right here, the wealthiest basically own a little bit less of the wealth of Europe. And that's because so many people have died. And this has often been used then to suggest, at least early on, what might happen in this pandemic. And here are some early articles on this topic, right? That it might end feudalism today, why the wealthy fear pandemics. And some of this has been walked back subsequently, but this is what was talked about very early on. Now, there's two real problems with this level of analysis. The first is that the Black Death killed approximately half the population of Europe. So I would suggest that's not exactly a recipe we want to follow, right? And the second thing is this drop in inequality doesn't hold for any other pandemic in human history, as far as I can tell, in recorded human history. So that the Black Death is really the outlier in this. And this was the argument we made in the Washington Post article very early on, right? If you follow this blue line and even into Piketty's new data in the red line, what you see here is a series of pandemics and epidemics that are happening across Europe all at this time. And none of this happens ever again, right? So that the Black Death is really an outlier. And what people were doing were going to the most outlying data and using that as their example. And I think at the end of this, we can also say, right, the stock market is doing pretty well. And as we all know, the rich have only gotten richer. You know, I can refer you here to Jeff Bezos if you really want to look up an issue of wealth. The other thing that's been talked about is that perhaps COVID will lead to some kind of renaissance. And here's just one article again. This has also been talked about throughout this pandemic. And again, the Black Death is the model. So I think you're getting a picture again why we wrote that first article, which I think actually holds up after almost a year, which I was surprised to see given what often happens with op-eds as you write them. But the issue here when it comes to the Renaissance is that plague outbreaks continued for 2 centuries after the initial outbreak in the 1350s, right? We didn't see a change in inequality, and we certainly don't see a change when it comes to some great Renaissance happening at the time. In fact, in some of those great Renaissance cities, you know, maybe many of you think about, whether it's Florence, whether it's Rome, all these great cities, they have significant severe outbreaks of plague throughout what we term the Renaissance period, right? And so people are dying at just as high of a rate, if not higher, you know, 1/3 of the population of the city dying. So you don't have a neat division from one to the other. And also, I'll just throw out that things don't get better just because we want them to. You have to work at it, which brings me to the last part of the talk. And here I'm going to suggest 3 other things we might be able to use historical information for that might shape actions moving forward. Now, the first is what we might call state-level resilience. And here I'll refer to the pandemic I've done a lot of work on, which is the Justinianic Plague of the 540s CE. And what we can think here from a state or national level is that we can use some of these ideas to think about how to make a state more resilient. Now, this doesn't mean people, this doesn't mean particular communities. I will address that shortly. But what I mean is a state-level function. And during the pandemic I study, what we see is a drop in trade in the couple of years after the pandemic, right? I don't think this would be surprising to many of us today. We see fewer grain shipments. That's the best way we can track trade. and they get reduced for about a year or two. But what we see within about 3 years after the pandemic is that they've returned to the level they were from before, and they were actually above the starting point. So that trade is increasing within about 5 years. And why is this? Well, it actually has to do with what we would now think about are redundancies in the system, inefficiencies in the system, right? Market inefficiencies. As I show you here on the diagram, what you can see is that it's clearly a boat that you either have to row or it has to be on a sail. So what the state assumes happens is that during this process, they're going to lose ships to storms, to shipwrecks, to bad weather. Some of the food's going to spoil. They have this all built into the system, right? Again, we would call these inefficiencies, but they assume that this is going to go wrong, that there's going to be a problem. And so this is one way in which we could build in inefficiencies in a system to sustain ourselves during crises as these arise. And there's also examples of this we could think about today. Here's a nice I guess we could say I got kind of depressed reading this article. If you look at the date, it's from 2017, and I've just highlighted the key part of the abstract of the findings, which basically was a series of studies done based on Taiwan about personal protective equipment, or PPE, as we probably all know very well, which Taiwan had stocked up in redundant amounts into their national chain and national supply. And what they were suggesting was that if the US or Canada or Australia or Singapore followed their model, you would have more slack in a system if a pandemic ever did happen, right? So they had learned something from SARS and built up redundant stocks of PPE. Right. So what they had suggested in this article is, like the Romans in the past, you do have to eat some costs, because that's what a state, if it wants to be resilient, has to do. So again, these are all plausible ways forward. Now, the last two things I want to point out are different scales that I think we have to think about, right? It's all well and good to think about state level resilience, state level efficiencies, but we also have to realize that there are people right at the center of this pandemic, right? We've almost kind of forgotten that at this point because the numbers have gotten so mind-bogglingly large, right? So individual people and individual stories really do matter. And here's just one example that I see pop up in my Twitter feed all the time, but there's many more of these, right? Multiple projects are doing this, right? They're telling stories, they're providing obituaries. Local voices from various regions are doing this around the country. You also see these based on race, based on ethnicity, based on religion, and all other types of backgrounds. And I think this is a really important thing that's happening in real time during this pandemic that's actually not been the case during previous ones. So this has been heartening to see these individual stories talked about. And the second level that need to be done, I would suggest, are at a community-focused level. And again, finding these rather, I guess, depressing studies. This one on the 1918 influenza pandemic, there's actually two of them. The one on the left is about Chicago, and it's looking at the impact of the pandemic. And again, I pulled out the key points of the abstract on different socioeconomic groups on the left. And on the right was a study done on Hartford about ethnic minorities in Hartford. It's almost entirely a white population in 1918, but there's large numbers of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. And what the one on the left clearly points out is that if you're poor, you're hit worse, and that they suggest that this needs to be addressed somehow in future pandemics, right? All of these came out, studies in the 1918 influenza pandemic before COVID itself. And the second one, which I now find, as we're all dealing with vaccinations at the moment, particularly depressing, because they're specifically saying the point of their studies that any future vaccine efforts need to target those from less privileged backgrounds, right? And again, we can very clearly see that is actually not happening during COVID. And here's just one example, and there's probably many more some of you have seen if you overlay the deaths, for example, in Chicago against who's getting vaccinated. It's basically a mirror image of each other, right? And this is just from Texas. I like this, this image is insightful, I think, because as you can see here, Dallas was trying to address some of these problems and the state cracked down on them. And I think this image, I assume they chose it purposely, is also great because the guy's wearing a Yale sweater as they're talking about privilege and socioeconomic and racial differences. So what we see here is something of a failure of immediate political decisions, even when presented with good historical and recent data, right? It's personal agency, personal politics overriding any structural or scientific knowledge. And in some ways, one way forward might be to suggest building in long-term structural possibilities that may help regardless of immediate political decisions. And here, this is just some new work that I'm thinking about at the moment, so it's in very rough form moving forward. And how would we think about this? How would we think about centering communities with less privilege and from different backgrounds, socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, that we might be able to do? Well, one intriguing question that's come up, and again, these studies are all before COVID actually broke out, is from this article, which is a demography study. And what it points out is that the case fatality rate among Black Americans during the 1918 influenza pandemic was higher, right? That's to say, if you got sick, you were more likely to die. But actually, if you look at the morbidity rate, that is to say, how many people got sick, it's actually lower among Black Americans than among white Americans, right? Why is this the case? The study has absolutely no idea. They suggest a few different possibilities, but no one's ever actually done the work on this. Now, I would suggest it certainly doesn't have to do with better medicine. It certainly doesn't have to do with less racist systems and structures. Neither of those are probably in play. But given that there's actually been no work on this, it actually brings up intriguing ideas, perhaps about potentially building in what we might call intuitive infrastructure or intuitive design features from the time to reduce sickness, right? So we could think about, for example, how we might design structures. And here I've just taken this from the Hood Design Studio. And as I said, this is very early work that another postdoc at SESYNC and I, Fuchsia Hoover, are starting to explore, is to understand how we might build in green infrastructure and more equitable systems of environmental justice into urban design, so that we can build in long-term redundancies so you don't just ignore the lessons of the past and you basically don't have to deal with perhaps as many short-term, right? So that you could think about building in systems that might function more equitably for people moving forward. So just to conclude, history offers useful ideas, but the policy lessons have clearly been ignored for immediate political needs and what's happening around us. And obviously we should all have hope. I'm not saying we don't have hope, but we have to work for what that hope is and work for a better outcome moving forward, right? And that policy, perhaps in the future, should focus on these different scales, right? On a state level, reducing efficiencies to build in long-term supplies, to focus stories on individuals who have been living through this pandemic, and that power and politics, obviously, as we all know, do matter quite a bit, and that perhaps one way we can address these questions are through long-term structural redesign and rethinking. So with that, thank you so much for being part, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Merle. That was tremendously interesting. So if you have a question, you can feel free to speak up, or you can put it in the Q&A. But I'll just open the questions. I wonder if you could talk about, just a minute, the rise of the city in modern times in terms of the fraction of the population that lives there, and if there's anything from history that tells you about the effect.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Basically, obviously, more dense urban places and pandemics tend to get a higher percentage of deaths. More people die in each place. That's certainly a case, and that's what happens when you see more dense urban centers. But this is a question why I think the 1918 influenza pandemic is a really interesting way to explore this, because in some ways, no one's really figured out at this exact moment in which more and more of the population is living in urban centers, how this may or may not have affected how many people die. And so we know, for example, in past examples, the most devastating impact of say, the Justinianic Plague is in the most dense urban centers, right? But are there ways in which we can think about designing urban places so that you have more space to go outside, right, during a pandemic, as we all are caught inside? So things like this is what I want to think through exactly, Margaret.
Oh, thank you. Interesting. So you did have one person asked you to just say a little bit more about inefficiencies, what you mean by that, and some more examples.
So this is something I've been thinking through, and I need to work with probably some economists on this in more detail. But from the one-to-one thing that really struck me from the beginning of this pandemic was in this Constantinople example, I pointed out that the grain supply and the food supply doesn't ever seem to be an issue at any point during the pandemic, right? But what we saw very quickly in COVID, as perhaps many of you remember in the early days, whatever that means anymore, was a combination of farmers plowing under their fields, right? Because the food supply chains were all messed up. And at the same time, the massive food banks, say in San Antonio, was the most famous image, right? Or that, as someone posted at some point on Twitter, and I could never find it again, they ordered 5 pounds of carrots and they got 1 5-pound carrot, right? Because when it's shipped to a restaurant, you get a giant carrot and no one cares what this looks like. But we've become so efficient in how we arrange our markets at this point that there's no slack in this. And this was clearly shown very early on. And I think supply chains have readjusted since then, but there are ways in which we can build up, I think, state capacity moving forward. And that's something I want to explore.
It's really interesting. And I'm sure you're aware that there's an ecological equivalent of redundancy and that it's believed to confer resilience in ecosystems. And we don't think of those as inefficiencies.
No, but it's very interesting, right? Because when I first asked this, when I first thought about this, it was to an immersion workshop where one of the participants is a marine fisheries economics person. And so he thought, oh yeah, we do this all the time, right? And so this is one way in which this can be brought to different fields.
Yes, I agree. So one last question. Glint asks, given the increase in connectedness and globalization between 1918 and today, do we see less of a correlation now between interventions at the city or state level in death rates than we did back then?
I don't know if anyone off the top of my head has run those numbers. I mean, it'd be hard to do because we're still going through COVID at the moment. So you'd have to, figure out what time period you want to slice up. I think things are traveling faster. I think things are getting impacted more, but I think ultimately all of the impact that we all feel individually is still very locally based, right? What your local city and your local town or your local village is doing or not doing is probably the most important thing, right? It's less about some of these global networks, as we always talk to people on our podcast and we say, where are you and what's happening there? And it's always struck me the not crazy, but the various ways different governments and different people have reacted. So we talked to a guy in Kazakhstan, which was completely different and time schedule and when COVID's hit them than say South Africa. So it's really important to look locally, I think.
And we're really seeing the effect of the local differences in the immunization rollout. After talking to colleagues in California and Georgia, Maryland's doing really well on their rollouts. Well, thank you so much, Merle. That's all the time we have now, but we appreciate it and we all want to give you applause.